So let's get started. Tonight and next week, we're going to be examining the biblical text known as the book of Job. I thought before doing so, we might just have a little bit of review, what you can remember from Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. What do you remember from Proverbs? If you had to just sum up what the... Was a teaching tool? Mm-hmm. Anything else about Proverbs? What was the tone? What was the sort of tone of Proverbs? What's that? Yeah, to live an upright life, and this was written during the post-exilic period. Things had gone wrong before, and this might be one reason why. Yes, and this notion of do well, do good, praise God, and you will be successful in a variety of ways. What about Ecclesiastes? What was the tone of Ecclesiastes? Can you remember? Vanity, vanity. All is vanity. Moreover, the successful aren't necessarily the good guys. It's what we call existential realism, okay, as opposed to abstract idealism. Proverbs is much more abstract and ideal. Ecclesiastes looks at life the way it is and calls it pretty straight. So when we look at the book of Job, it contains both themes, actually, and we'll see it as we go through. But I think you'll also notice that it really leans more in the direction of Ecclesiastes. Okay, the text... Robert Alter, and I've depended on him a lot, and I'll have a few more words to say about it, said about the book of Job, the most mysterious book of the Hebrew Bible. Indeed, some have wondered how this book, along with Ecclesiastes, ever made it into the Bible. I asked my friend Rabbi Mike, who I play golf with, and his answer was, namely, the Jewish tradition has always valued wrestling with God. This argument, this not just saying this is how it is, but really taking texts, taking them apart, analyzing them, disagreeing with them, agreeing with them, really arguing. It's always been part of the Jewish tradition and honored, and very much honored. So that might be one reason it was included in the Bible. Okay, I want to say just a few things about, I have Altman there, but it's actually Robert Alter, A-L-T-E-R, at the bottom. This is this book, the Wisdom books, which includes Job, Ecclesiastes, and Proverbs. I've depended a lot on that, so I thought since he's one of my main sources, give you a little bit of background about him. He's American professor of Hebrew and comparative literature at UC Berkeley, and he's taught there since 1967. He got a bachelor's degree from Columbia, a master's degree and doctorate from Harvard in comparative literature. He served on the Council of Scholars for the Library of Congress. He's been president of the Association of Literary Scholars and Critics, a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, and in 2018, he published his translation of the Hebrew Bible. So this is a man very much versed in the Bible and in comparative literature in general. So he's a very good source. So the book of Job is found in the Ketuvim. I think Reverend Albert mentioned this last week. It's the third major section of the Hebrew Bible, the first being the Torah, or the instruction and the law, and the second, the Nevi'im, or the prophets. So this comes from the third section, and it's the first of what we call the poetic books, because as you'll see, the majority of Job is a poem. Only small sections are prose, and I'll get to that in a moment. In terms of dating the text, I think Reverend Albert mentioned it last time, there's controversy here, a lot of controversy. The more traditional dates went back to the patriarchal age. This was the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, somewhere between 2100, 1800 BCE. That was sort of the traditional date that was given. This was based largely on the fact that the text has no mention of Moses or the Mosaic Law or any covenantal history. So it must have been pretty early. Most scholars today, however, and Alter follows this, and so does Kushner, who we'll get to momentarily, think that it was probably written somewhere between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, in that exilic, post-exilic period. That's the majority opinion today. During what we call the Babylonian captivity. Does everyone remember what the Babylonian captivity was? That's when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the Temple of Solomon, took the elite back to Babylon, and left everybody else more or less to survive or die, etc. And that was the time when the Jewish elite were away from Israel. And it was a fairly long period of time. And then they were eventually went back under Cyrus when the Persians conquered the Babylonians. What were some of the reasons that people think that this book was written at that time? The focal theme of human suffering expressed in the text would have been extremely relevant to the people at that time. So that's one reason that is given. The question of God's justice as regards his chosen people. That was in question. And then there's the influence of some Zoroastrian thought. Zoroastrianism was the religion in Babylonia, the Assyrian and Babylonian Empire. And it was dualistic, and it had a powerful force, which later the Christian devil sort of came out of, known as Ahriman, who is the evil one. And as we'll see when we look at Satan in the book of Job, the traditional Satan was really one of God's handymen. And that will remain in the book of Job. You'll see that. But there's a tone in there, and we'll look at that again, where Satan's, he's a little more devious in the book of Job, a little more even malevolent. And so that's that maybe that came from the influence of the evil force in Zoroastrianism. So those are the basic reasons given for dating the text at that time. As is the case with many biblical books, we know nothing about the author. We don't know who wrote it. We don't know any background, no biographical details. Back in 1637, there was a Capuchin monk by the name of Jacques Bolduc, who suggested in his commentary on the book of Job that it may have been authored by Moses, who found it in its original Aramaic form and then translated it into Hebrew. This shows you how far you can stretch things when you have a need. So that's not accepted by contemporary scholarship. But what it was an attempt to do was to tie the book to the original foundation, because it doesn't fit real well. And we'll see that as we go along. So the book is generally linked to a much broader category this was mentioned by Elbert last time, called Near Eastern wisdom literature. This doesn't just apply to biblical texts. There was a whole genre through Sumeria, even into Egypt, of these wisdom books, consisting of statements of sages that offered teachings about divinity, about virtue. But the utterances weren't philosophically or theologically systematized. They didn't try and create a system. Like if you see in Proverbs, right? There's no system there. There are just some insights that are given. Okay? And so there was this whole area of Middle Eastern wisdom literature, and the book of Job can be seen within that. The other thing about this genre was it tended to be universalistic in perspective. It wasn't speaking to any one religion necessarily. These were universal truths that these sages came up with. And the book of Job fits this perspective in that there are no Israeli characters in the book. Job isn't an Israeli. We don't know what he was. Okay? Some people thought there was an actual Job that existed, but that's even doubted. He's sort of a character that's fictionally created to fit into this larger universalistic notion of wisdom literature. The other thing that this wisdom literature does, and it's sort of a forerunner in many ways to what we'll find in Western theology, it reflects on what is known as theodicy. Has anyone ever heard the term theodicy? Go look it up. No. What theodicy means is the vindication of God. So if I told you it means the vindication of God, what might your next question be? Vindication of what? What do you think it might be? If you were in an argument with God today, with someone about God, what's one of the arguments they might come up with that would counter God? Evil. Why is there evil in the world? Why does this shooting happen today? Why is there okay, we add those all up. Theodicy are attempts to vindicate God despite all of these things. That's what a theodicy is. So it takes to resolve the theological issue of the great problem of evil. How do you fit your God into the reality of the world where there's so much evil? And there have been numerous theodicies over the ages. You find them in the middle. I think Job is to some extent fits into that category. But you find them right through Western theology. You find it in Calvin. You find it. Most all thinkers have to come up. This is a big question. You have to answer that for yourself somehow. You don't just say, "Oh, okay, push that aside." Okay, so this is how this book fits. Now, there's quite possible, and I think most scholars agree, there were actually two authors of Job, not just one. And that's because there are two very distinct parts of the book. But before I get there, I should probably give you an example of a non-biblical piece of wisdom literature. It was entitled Man and His God. And we actually have the tablet, the copy of the tablet from which it was on. This was written during the Ur III period, about 2000 BCE. It's a Sumerian text. In it, a young man proclaims that the day shines bright over the land, but for him, the day has become black. The bright day has become a day of tears, lament, and despair, which may be what a lot of parents are going through right now. Okay? Suddenly that bright day turns dark. I mean, this is written in 2000. This has been a universal question. Why do these things happen? The writer's main thesis, and this is important for later, is that in such cases of suffering and adversity, no matter how seemingly unjustified, the victim has but one valid and effective recourse: to continually glorify his God, keep wailing and lamenting before him. Thus the author declares, "Let a man utter constantly the exaltedness of his God until he turns a favorable ear to his prayers." So despite all the things you go through, the advice is what? Don't give in to despair. Keep the faith, as it were. Okay. Now, a number of scholars see this view of actually indicative of the political situation at the time. What was the political situation at the time? Supreme ruler atop. Usually these rulers are close to gods themselves. You wanted, whatever that god or that ruler did, you more or less had to obey. I mean, it was impractical to do anything else. So it's sort of this notion that in certain aspects of life, you just have to submit. Because the alternative, what's the alternative? If you're in an all-powerful system or an all-powerful God and you decide not to submit, okay. So it's interesting that this question existed as early as this text itself. So I just stated there are probably two authors to the book of Job. And this is because the text can be divided into two specific sections, which don't conveniently fit together into a consistent whole. The first section is known as the frame story. It's very short. It consists of chapter 1, chapter 2, and parts of the last chapter, chapter 42. There are a lot of chapters in between, okay? From 3 to 41. That's not the frame story. So according to Alter, and also, has anyone heard of this gentleman? Rabbi Harold Kushner, who wrote, he wrote When Bad Things Happen to a Good People, but he also wrote this book after it, based on the book of Job, When Bad Things Happen to a Good Person. Has anyone read the first one? Okay. His story was he had a 14-year-old son who died of progeria, I think it's called. That's where you age very rapidly. And at 14 years old, he died looking like a 90-year-old person. And this shook the rabbi up. And he spent a lot of time reflecting on this question. How can this happen? Why do things like this happen? Well, in any case, I'd suggest reading it, and I'll get back to him later. Both of them believe that there was the frame story was originally oral, probably circulated. A lot of texts were originally oral and then later written down. So if it was written down, even let's say in the 7th, 6th, 5th century, the oral tradition probably went way back. That's part of the frame story. And it's fairly straightforward, as we'll see. In it, Job suffers, accepts his suffering, and in the end is rewarded. It's pretty clear. and we'll go through that a little bit. I should probably also mention that you do find a character named Job in the book of Ezekiel. There's a character there. He was an exemplary righteous man of antiquity, and the author of this framework story may have selected him as his hero. But again, he wasn't a real person. Job was not a real person. So that's the first section, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 42. See why it's called the frame story? It's the frame on each side of the second section, chapters 3 through 41, vast majority of the text, is written in poetry and strikes a much different tone. Here, Job argues vehemently with several friends over the question of his suffering, and more significantly, he eventually confronts God himself. In this regard, Rabbi Kushner maintains that, quote, anguish has rarely been given a more powerful expression. So it's interesting that we have the frame story, which has sort of one tale, and then from 3 all the way is a very different story. It's Alter's contention that the author of the poetic section should be thought of as a writer working alone, a bold, dissenting thinker, and a poet of genius. Apparently, from what I've read, the poetry is just beautiful. Just beautiful. who produced a book so powerful that Hebrew readers came to say that they wanted it in, or then that might be one reason, even though it was going against the mainstream majority of biblical interpretation. So in terms of the text, tonight we're going to look at the frame story, and then next week we'll turn to the poetic section. So you're going to get it easy tonight, more or less. So, in the opening lines of the prologue, these are chapters 1 and 2, we are told, there was once a man named Job who lived in the land of Uz. A number of scholars have located this land in Edom, across the Jordan River, not in Israel. That's important. Robert Alter considers it more of what he calls it a never-never land. It's not a real place. Job isn't a real person. Uz isn't a real place. It's just a frame for this story. So the text continues. He was blameless, a man of integrity. He feared God and stayed away from evil. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 teams of oxen, 500 female donkeys. He also had many servants, and he was greater than all the dwellers of the east. So what's the image you get of this person? Rich, but also God-fearing, man of righteous, he's got integrity. I mean, he is the ideal type of the perfect being, almost. This is what, like the perfect believer. Well, we'll see. It's not quite so simple, but yes. So next we are told Job's sons would take turns preparing feasts in their homes. They would also invite the 3 sisters to celebrate with them. When these celebrations ended, sometimes after several days, Job would purify his children. He would get up early in the morning and offer a burnt offering for each of them. For Job said to himself, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And this was his regular practice. So he's not only just taking care of himself, he's saying prayers and offering sacrifices for his family. Now, this was a pastoral pre-national setting. There's no temple. There's no priesthood. Job is just a pious monotheist performing his own sacrifice to God. The passage also indicates Job's concern that his children have a pious relationship with God. So the text now switches to a heavenly court, where various members, referred to as the sons of God, have come to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan has come with them. Several scholars have pointed out that this celestial entourage, if we want to call it, is likely a literary vestige of pre-monotheistic notion of a council of gods, as reflected in several of the Psalms. For example, Psalm 82, we find, God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. I said, you are gods, you are all sons of the Most High, but you will die like mere mortals, you will fall like every other ruler. So there's the notion that this God is high, but there are other gods. And what this probably reflects is Judaism, in its, I don't even call it Judaism at that point, its early development was probably not monotheism developed out of something else that was already there. Probably a type of polytheistic sin. Also, ethical monotheism develops out of something prior to that. Probably seen in the question of the sacrifice of Isaac, because this was something that was practiced at that time. and sacrifice your first son. But with Abraham, we see a bit of a movement towards, because he can't sacrifice his son, ethical monotheism. In any case, so the council meets. And the Lord asks Satan, he's speaking with Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, I have been patrolling the earth, watching everything that is going on there. Then the Lord asked Satan, have you noticed my servant Job? He's the finest man in all the earth. He is blameless, a man of complete integrity. He fears God and stays away from evil. Satan replied to the Lord, yes, but Job has good reason to fear God. You have always put a wall of protection around him in his home and his property. You have made him prosper in everything he does. Look how rich he is. But if you reach out and take away everything he has, then he will surely curse you to your face. So what's Satan doing? He's challenging God. Now, this is where perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, more of a Zoroastrian flavor comes in. Because Satan, I think, is mentioned 30 times in the Hebrew Bible, something like that. And he's always sort of one of God's helpers. He patrols and lets God moving. But you see here, there's a little more to this guy here than just that. He's kind of tempting God, isn't it? He's baiting him. And you know what? God takes the bait. As we see. So, as we move on. All right, you may test him, the Lord said to Satan. Do whatever you want with everything he possesses, but don't harm him physically. So Satan left the Lord's presence. So, the role of Satan in the ancient Hebrew idea was one of God's helpers, who puts the Lord's servants to the test. Although, like we mentioned here, it's interesting to notice this is a little more than that. Notice he patrols. He says, where have you been? I've been patrolling, looking around, coming back and reporting. One Yale University scholar, Professor Emeritus Marvin Pope, said he was a kind of intelligence agent working for the Lord. So this was the notion of Satan. So beginning in chapter 1, verse 13, we see the results of Satan's hand. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting at the oldest brother's house, a messenger arrived at Job's home with this news. Your oxen were plowing, with the donkeys feeding beside them, when the Sabians raided us. They stole all the animals, killed all the farmhands. I am the only one who escaped. While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. The fire of God has fallen from heaven and burned up your sheep and all the shepherds. I am the only one who escaped. While he was speaking, a third messenger arrived with this news. 3 bands of Chaldean raiders have stolen your camels and killed your servants. And I am the only one who escaped. While he was still speaking, another messenger arrived with this news. Your sons and daughters were feasting in their oldest brother's home. Suddenly, a powerful wind swept in from the wilderness, hit the house on all sides. The house collapsed, and all your children are dead. Okay, and it's interesting to note that refrain that is used continually, and I am the only one who has survived to tell you, was also used by Herman Melville in his novel Moby Dick, when at the end of the story, it's Ishmael, after the Pequod has gone down, says, and I am the only one who has survived to tell you. In fact, a number of scholars have noticed that Melville made a lot of use of the book of Job throughout his novel Moby Dick. So the text then continues. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. Then he shaved his head and fell to the ground to worship. Shaving his head was a common sign of mourning throughout the ancient world. But interestingly, it was prohibited in Israel. Thus, it was another way of reminding the audience that Job is not an Israelite. Falling to the ground to worship, of course, indicates a state of humility. Then Job said, I came naked from my mother's womb, and I will be naked when I leave. The Lord gave me what I had, and the Lord has taken it away. Praise the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin by blaming God. Here, Robert Alter comments, Job's acceptance of his dire fate, which gives notion to the phrase, the patience of Job, is cast as a two-line poem vividly contrasting his two states of nakedness. Naked he came from his mother's womb, the earth from which the first man was made, and naked he shall return to the earth via the grave. Alter then adds, there is something existential in this brief poetic statement. Whatever a man acquires in life, even in the children he begets, are but mere additions to the fundamental condition of nakedness in which he enters and leaves life. We also need to note that in praising the name of the Lord, Job makes exactly the opposite declaration than the one Satan expected. So in chapter 2, the sons of God again present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also comes with them to present himself before him. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? Satan answered the Lord, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. And he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Skin for skin, Satan replied. A man will give all he has for his own life, but now stretch out your hand and strike his flesh and bones, and he will surely curse your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, he is in your hands, but you must spare his life. In folk-style tradition, there's some verbatim repetition, as you've probably noticed, of the language found in the council meeting in chapter 1. However, there is some new material here, as seen in the line where God has accusatory words for the accuser Satan, where he says, and he still maintains his integrity, though you incited me against him to ruin him without any reason. Here we see a sign that God has some mistrust in his helper Satan. Skin for skin is a proverb, meaning what is most precious to a man is his own physical being. In the end, he is prepared to sacrifice for everything, even the lives of his loved ones, but hurt him badly in his own flesh and bones, and he will abandon all of his principles of integrity. So says Satan. Now, God's acquiescence in this scene has become a puzzle and a problem for ethical monotheism, in that it pictures God as to some degree being under the sway of Satan's maliciousness. Consequently, some commentators have suggested that the origins of the folk tale actually predate the emergence of ethical monotheism, perhaps back to the time of Abraham and the story of his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, all of that being pre-ethical monotheism leading into ethical monotheism. So returning to the text. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with sores. Some translations speak of a burning rash that stretched from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Then Job took a piece of broken pottery and scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Concerning this last passage, Robert Alter has commented as follows. Job's wife assumes that cursing God will immediately cause Job's death, which might be just as well. Or that given his ghastly state, he will soon die anyway, so he might as well curse the deity that cast these horrors upon him. In either case, her use of the phrase, "Are you still maintaining your integrity?" or clinging to your innocence, Alter says is sarcastic. What is the point of your innocence, she is saying, after all that has happened? What does it matter if you are guilty or innocent? You are suffering. It's also noteworthy that as in Genesis, it is a female who acts as a type of temptress here, tempting her husband to abandon his faith. Job replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. That is, he did not curse God. When Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes and met together by agreement to go and sympathize with him so as to give him comfort. All come from regions east of the Jordan River, so again they're non-Israeli. When they saw Job from a distance, they could hardly recognize him. They began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Both of these are stylized forms of grief. Then they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. Now, 7 is a vital number in Judaism, symbolizing completion. It is prominent throughout the Torah, from creation of the world in 7 days, 6 days plus one of rest, to each of the 7 plagues of Egypt. There are hundreds of other connections to the number 7, including when an immediate relative dies. Shiva, which means 7, is sat for 7 days. So in the text, the 7 days are indicative of the completion of a round of mourning. No one said a word to Job because they all saw how great his suffering was. Note here that the friends have nothing negative to say, and indeed appear to sympathize with Job in his plight. Let us now turn our attention to chapter 42, verses 10 through 17, generally referred to as the book's epilogue. Like chapters 1 and 2, it is written in prose and is considered the end piece of the earlier framework story. Verses 1 through 10 in this final chapter make reference to the poetic section and were likely added to the original framework to give the two sections some sense of cohesion. And we'll look at these opening lines of 42 next week. So for the moment, we find the following. After Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. All his brothers and sisters and everyone who had known him came and ate with him in the house. So the breaking of bread together marks the end of his sort of pariah status, his return to the community. They comforted and consoled him over all the trouble the Lord had brought on him. And each one gave him a piece of silver and a gold ring. And the gold ring was a nose ring, not a finger ring, which is, again, non-Israeli. The Lord blessed the latter part of Job's life more than the former part. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. And he also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. Nowhere in all the land were there found women as beautiful as Job's daughters. And their father granted them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the 4th generation. And so Job died an old man and full of years. So let us conclude tonight's class with the comments of Robert Alter on this last section. As countless readers have objected, this doubling of property is scarcely adequate compensation for all Job's sufferings, and even more so, the 10 new children scarcely heal the wound of the loss of the first 10 lives. But the book ends in the folk tale world of a frame story, whereby everything is reduced to schematic patterns, formulaic numbers, and perhaps in this world, such a question cannot properly be asked. Next week, we will turn to the poetic section and its probing disputations.